Hello, I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem. I am your host for this podcast, and for this episode, it is just me and my little friend, my little dragon friend. Isn't he adorable? My little dragon friend is joining us today because I just gave a lecture at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, for a group of students from Oldsfield Girls School, and the topic was monsters, myths, and legendary creatures. And one of my very lovely colleagues printed a whole bunch of dragons so that the girls could take something home with them. And this little guy came home with me. Yay. We love 3D printed dragons. In fact, I am kind of obsessed with 3D printed dragons, and it's maybe not a good thing that I now know that one of my colleagues prints them and just prints them all the time. I may end up with a passel of 3D printed dragons. Anyway, for this podcast episode, I'd like to take the opportunity to kind of wrap up everything from the International Medieval Congress. Now, if you pay attention to my TikTok, which is something that I am still coming to grips with because TikTok, I'm a little old for TikTok, honestly, but coming to grips with it. If you've been paying attention to my TikTok videos or to my Instagram posts, you'll have noticed that I did a series of short 30-second interviews with young up-and-coming scholars at the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo at the University of Western Michigan. Now, Kalamazoo is a conference that happens every year. The only years that we missed were 2020 for the pandemic and 2021. We had to kind of get used to coming back, and we started having more virtual sessions as a consequence. In fact, 2021 was pretty much virtual. Now, I'm sure that many of you are thinking, what's the big deal? It's a medieval conference. Yes, it is one of two of the largest medieval conferences globally. In fact, the major medieval conferences for all different kinds of disciplines occur at Kalamazoo, Michigan in May, and then at the University of Leeds in England in July. Now, both of them are international medieval congresses, and they often work together to kind of sort out what sessions are going to be held and the like. Now, they don't actually operate in tandem, but you get a lot of people who go to Kalamazoo, go to Leeds, one or both. And they really are the largest venues for academic medievalists. Now, before you get excited, these are the academic medievalists. This is not like a con. This is not like a Ren fair. We are there to do academic work. No, really, we are. We're there to do academic work. In fact, my first experience with the International Medieval Conference in Kalamazoo was 1995. I had just finished my third year at Florida State as an undergraduate, and my professor, David Johnson, said that I should go to Kalamazoo if I really wanted to be a medievalist so that I could see what I was in for. It was quite an experience, not least of which because of the number of well-known, widely published academics who were there that you can talk to, even as an undergraduate, which I was. I had just turned 21. I was about to head to Ireland to do my last year of undergraduate as an international student, and this was a new thing for me. Now, 30 years ago, going to Kalamazoo was very different than Kalamazoo now. We all stayed in the dorms. Everybody, because it's the cheapest option, and that's where everybody was. Now, over the years, some people have decided that dorm life is just not for them, and they stay in hotels, or there are nicer dorms on campus that are a little further away from where we all used to be. But some of us diehards still stay in the dorms. And if you saw my TikTok video from my dorm room, I drive so that I can bring everything with me. We have the food, the coffee, the bar, which is very important because this is also a social event where lots of medievalists can get together. Not all of them have to drink. We have lots of coffee and occasionally sweets. And We get together to talk about our ideas, to meet new people in the field, and to hear conference papers. And a conference paper for an academic is very often the starting point for larger productions, for larger publications. Almost everything I have published started as a conference paper at some point in time. You give a 20-minute conference paper, and then you get feedback. You have people in the audience who may or may not end up being publishers or editors or authors themselves or some of the best and biggest names in medieval studies. Now, that is an invaluable resource. And for the most part, people are very professional, they are very constructive and very helpful. I say for the most part, because really, at the end of the day, they're academics. And some academics aren't particularly nice to other academics. There was a culture, particularly, sorry, the dragon's just distracting me. There was a culture and a time when, of course, medieval studies was not particularly welcoming to all members in the field. And I say there was a time. I'm not 100% certain that we are out of that time. In fact, it is a constantly evolving landscape where scholars coming in and scholars who are in the field already need to reevaluate where we are when it comes to discussions of race, racism, sex, sexism, gender, sexuality, gender identity. These are all constantly shifting issues within the field of medieval studies itself. And how medieval studies deals with it or doesn't deal with it, partly shapes our ability to attract new members. Now, all of this, of course, is in the wider scope of the world where the humanities are under attack. And I don't say that as hyperbole. There are universities in England that are shuttering humanities programs as we speak. I have gotten 3 emails in the last week about universities in England. These universities are closing literature programs, language programs, history programs, philosophy programs. And obviously, if you're watching my podcast, you have an interest in history, you have an interest in literature, but you have to understand that the academic disciplines at university level are under assault. The money is being sucked away from those fields because people don't consider them valuable. And I put valuable in massive big quotation marks because an awful lot of those administrators who are making those decisions, and it's happening in the US as well, they don't know anything about actual academia. They're interested in the bottom line and money. And you might say, okay, well, that's necessary. That's a good thing too. We have to prepare students to go into the quote real world and get them real jobs. I got news for you. It doesn't matter what profession you study. If you don't actually have a good grasp of the humanities, by which I mean philosophy, history, literature, language, art history, if you don't have a good grasp of what it means to be human, you're not really going to do the world many favors regardless of your profession. So very famously in Dead Poets Society, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, Robin Williams, at the very beginning, he tells the students to huddle up. And of course, this is a posh, pretty much all white boys' school in New England in the 1950s. In fact, it is all white. Sorry, I had to think there for a second that maybe there might, no, all white, all boys' school in New England in the 1950s. That's the setting for the film. And he says to them that the professions like medicine, law, business, they're noble professions. They're valuable professions. They're necessary in many ways for a career and a stable life. But art, poetry, literature, language, this is what we stay alive for. This is what makes us human. Now I'm paraphrasing. But that always stuck with me. And in fact, Dead Poets Society inspired me in many ways to teach and inspired me to become the teacher that I currently am. I based my entire teaching philosophy off of Robin Williams and Dead Poets Society and my undergraduate professors who were phenomenal. Hello, hello. And so in talking about medieval studies and talking about the International Medieval Congress, it's important to make this point because fewer and fewer universities are actually offering the core classes in English and literature and languages and history that I had as an option when I was a student at Florida State 30 years ago. And on many levels, it breaks my heart, but it also actually reveals an awful lot of holes in the fabric of society, because these are the things that make us human. Understanding the complexity of history, understanding the complexity of literature and language, all of those things actually make it easier for us to relate to other people. And as universities start to dismantle their humanities, because they're like, well, you can't really get a job. What are you going to do? Teach? Okay, first of all, fuck you for that sentiment. Teachers are really important. Teachers work their butts off. Teachers are an integral part of our society. And this whole idea of those who can't do teach is bullshit. And I don't just say this as someone who teaches. I know several teachers. My sister was a teacher for 30 years. She's now an administrator at a middle school in Florida. I know few people who work as hard as my sister. My sister's a phenomenal teacher and she's a phenomenal educator. And she is one of hundreds of thousands, millions of teachers across the world who decided that they wanted to spend their lives educating your kids and you. So this is a valuable thing that teachers do. And when it comes to the humanities, when people say, well, what do you do with an English major? You could just teach. Again, see my previous comment about teaching. But the humanities, you want to know what you can do with a degree in English, degree in history? The answer is anything. Because the skills that we teach you in English classes, in history classes, are transferable to any kind of profession, to any kind of occupation or job. It doesn't matter what you choose to do. We teach you the skills to exist in the world and to ideally coexist with other people. And as this world gets increasingly fractured, it's important to remember that. In English classes, we teach you to formulate ideas, think critically, articulate and communicate your thoughts. Part of what we do, formulating arguments, opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one. But arguments are making a point persuasively with evidence. And we teach those skills. We teach them in English classes. We teach them in history classes. We teach them in philosophy classes. So when you say, well, what can you do with a degree like that? That's all useless stuff. It isn't useless stuff. And as the universities in this world, in England, the UK, in the US, everywhere, as they start to cut back humanities, the world is actually going to get worse. We are in a crisis in this world, not just in the US or in England or in Europe, but in African countries, in India, in China, in Japan, all over the world. We are in political crises. Some of it is larger than others. Some of it is more pronounced than others. Some of it is something that is so dangerous that it's kind of shocking to think that we're going to be able to survive it. But the more educated we are, the more we focus on the qualities that we share in common, the more we focus on what it means to be human, the better off we are. And the better equipped we are to actually solve the problems facing the world today. Those who don't understand history or don't study history are condemned to repeat it. Well, we could also say that history happens in cycles. I would argue that the more ignorant everyone is, the less stable, the less secure we all are. People who don't understand democracy are the ones who try to dismantle it. People who don't understand democracy are the ones who don't fight for it. All of these things are related, which again brings me back to my point about studying medieval history, medieval literature, law, the Middle Ages, and the International Medieval Congress. Now, I was part of a session at the Medieval Congress that was essentially about teaching medieval studies in the current political climate. In this country, academics have been targeted for teaching quote unquote woke ideas, including too much DEI, that would be diversity, equity, and inclusivity. I had to think about that for a second. DEI, scary. Oh my gosh. Why on earth would we ever possibly want to teach diversity? Because we live in a diverse world. None of us live in a vacuum. And if we want to understand the basic tenets of human dignity and human rights, we need to learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, in the last 10 or 15 years, these words have become scary. They have become problematic. In the session I was in, I was a respondent, and I was a respondent to 3 excellent papers that talked about how professors may or may not feel that they can speak their mind. And you often hear that conservative professors feel like their views are more marginalized. I would disagree with that because there are plenty of conservative professors who've been able to say whatever the fuck they want for centuries. Perhaps it is more the case that now people are pushing back. Perhaps now it is more the case that progressive professors and liberal professors actually have traction to say something and point out the inequities in the system that have existed since the beginning of that system. Now, university education should be about forming the holistic person, not just training you for a profession. There was a time where you could get a perfectly good professional degree that didn't require that you take gen ed classes in anything. But that actually does those people a disservice too. My mother is a retired nurse. And one of the things that makes my mother an excellent nurse when she was actively working in the OR and in the ER was her capacity to relate to people and her capacity for compassion. You can go into a medical profession and be clinical and have the material and know what you're doing. My niece just graduated from Florida State with a degree in nursing. She will make an exceptionally good nurse. And not just because of her nursing classes, but because she's also had to read and study and take classes outside of medicine and nursing so that she understands people's cultural context, so that she can relate to people when they come to her in the emergency room in pain, afraid, possibly bleeding, possibly grievously injured, or simply worried about somebody who is. When we learn about history and literature and the world, we learn about people. And for centuries, that access to education has been tightly regulated. It's only in the last 100 years or so that education has been far more widely accessible. In many respects, our educational model has been based on the political aims and the political agendas in the countries where these universities began, or where the universities themselves were kind of shaped. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So I've mentioned it before with other medieval colleagues of mine. Medieval studies as a discipline, the whole idea of, okay, we're going to study the Middle Ages. What does that mean? Medieval. Going from 476 CE until 1453-ish-esque, or 1485, or 1509, pick an end date. Or maybe just consider it as a continuing trajectory and timeline that doesn't actually end or stop at any one point. The entire decision to say, this is medieval, in large part in academic settings in universities, was determined by 19th century nationalism. I've mentioned that before, so let me unpack that a little bit for you. 19th century nationalism, particularly in Europe, was this desire to create a national identity, to say, right, we now have new national boundaries that need to be protected, but we also need to define ourselves. Who are we as a Dane? Who are we as an Englishman? Who are we as a Frenchman? all of these ideas were because there was so much contest for centuries about colonialism, colonial exploration, colonial domination, the exploitation of indigenous people, people spreading out from their original plot of land into new territories and taking their cultural identity with them. Colonization is the act of planting a colony. Colonialism is an ideology and a mindset that says our way is much better. So now that we're here, you all have to talk like we do, dress like we do, eat what we do, worship the same gods that we do. This idea of cultural colonialism that basically seeks to erase or adapt and absorb the local indigenous populations into their own to create this kind of dominant colonial hegemony. It's been going on 19th century. It really starts at the very beginning of European expansion in the 15th century. Thank you, Columbus, who was genocidal, who wiped out indigenous populations in his quest for claiming territory for Spain and Portugal. That is an uncomfortable history, but it is a true history. And it is far more important for us to understand it and study it than it is to pretend it didn't happen. When you look at the quest for creating medieval studies, part of it was that desire to maybe not focus on the negative stuff, to maybe not emphasize the atrocities, the genocide, the cultural imperialism, as some of these powers decided to take their influence over the whole world. Because if you take colonialism and do it everywhere, that's imperialism. Now, 19th century scholars who were looking at medieval manuscripts, medieval chronicles, in a lot of cases, they didn't know what they were looking at. They couldn't read the language, or they had to figure out how to read the language. That's an important point. If you consider that in so many ways, the beginning of the studies of medieval literatures and language start in the 18th century and really develop and evolve in the 19th century with people who had to figure out how to read Old English, had to figure out how to read Old Irish or Middle Irish, because the modern iterations of those languages are completely different. So I will give 19th century scholars and researchers credit where it is due. I'm having a dragon day. So as they were doing that, as they were kind of figuring out what sources they had, what sources they could read, and what these sources mean, or what they meant for them, they were shaping the narrative of medieval history for their own ends. Now, in some cases, they just did that. It never occurred to them that they were in somehow distorting the medieval history or the medieval past. I mean, the nature of scholarship is you got to start somewhere, and you start from your own frame of reference. Everybody does. It's impossible to say that you don't. But as the field itself developed over the course of the 19th century, 20th century, and more people had access to these texts, to this history, the field itself shifted and changed. If you look at the scholarship from the early 20th century, it doesn't look anything like the scholarship now when it comes to the Middle Ages, particularly medieval literature. That's not necessarily a bad thing or an incorrect thing, but it certainly does say more about the time in which that scholarship was being done. And at the turn of the century, most universities were exclusively male. In Oxford and Cambridge, women could study, but they couldn't actually get a degree from Oxford or Cambridge, not until at least the 1920s or 30s. I'm not 100% certain of the exact date, but women could study at an Oxford college like Magdalen, but they couldn't actually get an Oxford degree until about the 1920s. So by and large, university education was the purview of men. Men of means. If you got scholarship money, or if you were able to attend university without having lots of money, you generally worked your way through. But for the most part, it was considered a privilege. And the privileged class produced the scholarship. Therefore, it was their frame of reference that shaped how we thought of the medieval world. And for the most part, that image that was created is one of a white, hegemonic, Christian, European, patriarchal society. And as many of the episodes of the podcast have shown, that wasn't the reality. And it's over the last 100 years, in the 1900s and 1910s, 20s, the 20th century. It's kind of what I mean, the 20th century, particularly starting in the 1970s and 80s, where you start to see second wave feminism. You start to see all different literary theories applied to medieval texts and sources. When you start to see a much larger body of female scholars and scholars of color and scholars from different disciplines and backgrounds working on medieval texts, that our impression of the Middle Ages changes. Now, I wish I could say that academia changed with it. To an extent, yes. And in fact, there are far often more women in certain disciplines of academic study than men. It depends on the academic study. But medieval studies itself has long remained kind of the domain of white, older men. Now, this is not an attack on those men, because many of them are lovely. Many of them have done due diligence in their work and their resources. So please do not come at me with not all men. Oh, for fuck's sake. Obviously not all men. But when the status quo is white male patriarchy, when the status quo for examining the Middle Ages is that idea that somehow the Middle Ages was exclusively white, exclusively male, exclusively Christian, because that's the dominant narrative, other voices are seen as marginal, when in fact the reality of the Middle Ages has shown us in the last 10, 15, 20 years that really those other voices are not minorities, not by any stretch of the imagination. And yet, the discipline itself has often been unwelcoming to women, scholars of color, both male and female, scholars who are LGBTQ or trans. Of course, I do know that the T is the trans in that, but I'm specifying for trans scholars specifically in the last 5 to 6 years, arguably the last 10 since the first Trump administration. Things have gotten more dangerous for trans scholars, full stop. Things have gotten more dangerous for trans people, full stop. Something that is wrong and unconscionable, and something that at least this country should really do something about. The anti-trans rhetoric has been hideous, and it has led to the death of trans people for nothing more than existing. Now, again, the modern political climate, well, how do you talk about these things in a public university? Private universities have a little more leeway because they're private. But how do you talk about these things in a public university? That was the whole focus of the panel that I was in at the IMC. So how do we do it? We do this. We're honest. We admit the reality. I am a middle-aged, because I am 52, I am a middle-aged, white, cisgender, heterosexual woman. My frame of reference is not the same as several of my colleagues, and I have to acknowledge the privilege that I am in as a white woman. And you might say, but woman, yeah, women, we suffer our own form of discrimination, misogyny. Society has treated us like shit. But white women profit from patriarchy. White women profit from racism, because both of those systems are designed to protect us as though we need protecting. That whole putting women up on pedestals, yeah, they mean us. Doesn't do us any favors not to acknowledge it, call it out, and to be actively anti-racist. Now, in a lot of regards, medieval scholars didn't actively even think about this if they were white, or white women or men. It didn't matter. I mean, it is not something I actively even really thought about until about 10 years ago. And I say that because, again, I was a white woman. Well, I am a white woman, and I was coming up through a European system where, I was somewhat accepted, but not universally so. In fact, I remember when I was a graduate student and I went to some of my first conferences in England, and there was a male scholar, a young man who was my age, and he was a graduate student at the time. And I remember most distinctly that when I refused to go out with him, he got particularly nasty and started saying that I would never make it in academia because I was too much of a quote party girl. Because I went to conferences and, like everybody else there, we'd have a drink, we'd chat, we would hang out with each other. It's a very sociable event. It is what you do, everybody. But when I rejected him, he decided to make that a marker of my capacity to succeed as an academic. Nobody would have ever said that to a male scholar. Nobody would say it to a male scholar now. No one's going to say to a white male scholar, you know what? You're too social. You'll never succeed in academia. That never happens. The expectations for different groups of people within academia are often higher based on their gender, their sexuality, their sexual identity, or their race or ethnicity. That is a fact, and it is something that we need to actively work hard to dismantle. And in the last 10 years, medieval studies has had to grapple with this because in 2017, there was a big protest, a rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, at the time, I was teaching at Longwood University in Farmville, Virginia, which is 70 miles due south of Charlottesville. So this actually had a great impact on the way I was teaching, the classes I was teaching, and everything I have taught since then. The Unite the Right rally in August of 2017 started with a march on the Friday night through the campus of UVA around a statue, Thomas Jefferson, on the campus, that essentially had all the hallmarks of a Nazi propaganda march. And I don't say that with hyperbole either. This was a crowd of white men carrying tiki torches, marching through campus in Charlottesville, all in advance of the Unite the Right rally the next day that was entirely designed to protest the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee that had been voted on and agreed to by the Charlottesville City Council. White supremacists, far-right activists from all over the country came to Charlottesville, Virginia, to protest the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee that had been voted on by the people in Charlottesville. And their argument was that Charlottesville was erasing history, that, oh God, if you take down the statues of Confederate generals, you're erasing history. No, you're not. The history still exists. Read a book. But on this occasion in 2017, that march brought in white supremacists, violent Christian nationalists, and people whose entire intent was to reaffirm the supremacy of white men in this country. And on that Friday night, a few thousand of them marched through UVA's campus carrying tiki torches and shouting Nazi slogans like "Jews will not replace us, blood and soil." Those are actual Nazi slogans. If you don't want to be called a Nazi, don't act like a Nazi. It's kind of simple. On that occasion, though, people had to suddenly step back and consider what was happening in this country. The next day, at the Unite the Right actual rally, heavily armed people carrying AR-15s, carrying weapons of all varieties, lined the streets as this Unite the Right white supremacists marched in Charlottesville. Now, it was a sanctioned march. They'd gotten permits. They were permitted to do it. And there were a lot of counter-protesters. Now, why this becomes an issue for us, I'll explain in a second. But that march, by and large, was peaceful. There was a lot of shouting, a lot of yelling that happens at protest marches. But one of those alt-right members took it one step further and drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, the people who were there to protest against the fascism, the tyranny, the white supremacy. This white supremacist drove his car into a group of counter-protesters and killed Heather Heyer and injured a dozen other people. The video is pretty hideous. I've seen it. That person decided to escalate the act of peaceful protest into one of outright murder. Now, why this is all important to medievalists is because an awful lot of those people marching in that alt-right rally decided to use the Middle Ages as their justification. They carried medieval-style shields. I'm putting that in massive big quotation marks. They carried medieval-style shields. They had helmets. They had flags with the crusading cross, the St. George's cross, the traditional flag of England. They had crusading badges. Some of them have tattoos. I'm looking at you, Pete Hegseth, with your Jerusalem cross tattoo, the pro-Crusades, anti-Islamic, anti-Semitic sentiments of supposedly the 11th, 12th, 13th century Crusades. Now, I say supposedly because, as I discussed with Dr. Richard Abels in our last episode, some of that sentiment wasn't nearly as anti-Islamic or anti-Semitic as modern audiences have thought. And in fact, the anti-Semitism and the anti-Islamicism that has come up in modern days does have a trajectory from the Middle Ages. It certainly exists. The roots of anti-Semitism go deep. They are hideous and they are atrocious. The anti-Islamic sentiment also goes very deep and very far back. But this new wave of it, using the Middle Ages as a justification for it, this is all on us. And these people who were marching decided to say, well, look at us. We have medieval history to support our argument. Yes and no. But the response to it, the response to Charlottesville, were a bunch of medievalists going, holy shit, this isn't cool. We don't want people to think that medievalists are okay with white supremacy. Some of them are, though. Let's be honest. Some medievalists are quite fine with white supremacy. The reaction of medieval organizations was to denounce this, rightly so. And in fact, there's a statement, Medievalists Respond to Charlottesville, that absolutely 100% condemns the use of medieval history in the Middle Ages somehow as a justification for anti-Semitism, anti-Islamicism, racism, or hatred of any kind. And a dozen organizations signed on to it. I was an executive officer in some of those organizations, the American Society for Irish Medieval Studies, Myrkstapa, Monster People, other societies dedicated to various forms of study of the Middle Ages signed on to this letter and said, this is not the Middle Ages. This is not what we study. This is not the reality. These people are distorting it. But they aren't in some respects. They're not completely distorting it, nor is medieval studies innocent of its own role in perpetuating white supremacy, misogyny, patriarchy, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamicism. Medieval studies has done its own part as a discipline to push those hateful narratives too. And that's what became a problem. Because sure, we could sign on and say, we condemn what happened in Charlottesville. 100% we're condemning it. Nobody wants to align themselves with Nazis. Really, nobody does except for Nazis. Keep that in mind. In fact, I was developing a course at the time, and I developed a course that I taught the next year. It was an upper level seminar, and it was called Monstrous Misappropriations, with the idea of looking at the way that different white supremacist groups have misappropriated the Middle Ages, the way that they have distorted it. We talked about the Nazis. We talked about fascist Spain, fascist Italy. We talked about the conflict in some of the groups of Northern Ireland. We talked about Odinists, who are the bad Odinists, the Odinists who are actually very white supremacists, not all Odinists, but there is a segment of it. We discussed that. And one of my students, as I was planning this class, actually asked me, he said, well, are you going to cover both sides? I looked at him, and the other students having this conversation outside my office looked at him, and I said, what do you mean, both sides? Well, now remember, President Trump, in the aftermath of Charlottesville, stood up and gave a press conference where he said that there were very fine people on both sides, on both sides. Now, whether he really meant it or not is kind of hard to tell because, there's so many things wrong with just the pattern of speech in that speech that he gave. And some of the sentence structure, and often he gets caught out and then makes shit up in order to try and dig himself out of a hole. Or at least he used to when he had full mental capacity, which I don't think he does now. It's my personal opinion. See Henry VIII and tertiary stage neurosyphilis. Just a theory. But when President Trump said that there were very fine people on both sides, he meant there were very fine people on the not Nazi side and on the Nazi side. As a consequence, a year later, one of my students wanted to know if I was going to cover both sides. The answer is no. My classes start from the premise that Nazis are bad. And I now say that at the beginning of every one of my classes every semester. And some of my students say, well, who the hell has to say that? This is why. In the current political climate that started back in 2016, 2017, the line between, well, we don't agree with fascism, right, is a lot less solid. That line's a lot blurrier. And this is one of the things that makes interrogating the history and the background of medieval studies so important for just about everybody and any discipline. We have to acknowledge the fact that our field was designed to essentially push this hegemonic white supremacist view of the superiority of the European Middle Ages. The medieval world was the world. There were complex civilizations in North Africa, in Ethiopia, in India, in China, in Japan, in South America, Central America. Vibrant, sophisticated, civilized societies. In some cases, more civilized than Europe. But European scholars had to diminish that. And they perpetuated it in their approaches and the way that they looked at things and sources. And in 2017, those chickens came home to roost. Now, in fairness, you could say the chickens came home to roost a little sooner because the Nazis loved the Middle Ages. I've talked about this before. Hitler saw himself almost as an incarnation of God, but also as an incarnation of King Arthur or even Charlemagne. Himmler definitely saw himself as a King Arthur figure. And they actually have photographs of the SS dressed in full 15th century plate armor. In the castles of Trifles and Wewelsburg, they constructed chambers that were meant to evoke the round table and that culture of knighthood. Martin Schickman and Laurie Finke wrote an exceptionally good piece called Exegetical History, Nazis at the Round Table. I teach that article every semester. They published it in 2004, they reprinted it in 2014, and I teach it every semester because that article points out that there is a certain fascist aesthetic in Arthurian texts, in the actual medieval texts, that the Nazis latched onto. They didn't have to distort it. It was already there. There are aspects of medieval literature and history that are sexist, misogynistic, racist, anti-Semitic, anti-Islamic. They exist absolutely 100%. And so those modern hate groups have only just had to adapt it. But in Charlottesville, they put it forward as their shield and their justification. And what happened after that was an unbelievable groundswell of debates and arguments on what was then Twitter and Facebook. I'm old. Facebook. Scholars who'd actually known each other for years start ripping each other apart for this debate about, no, we can't possibly say our field is founded in racism. Yes, we can, because it is. Just is. But people didn't want to acknowledge it. Some people still don't. The revision of terms, looking at our actual history and saying, hey, particularly for American scholars, not wanting to use Anglo-Saxon, because in medieval terms, Anglo-Saxon as a composite people doesn't really exist. It shows up in a couple texts once or twice, but that's it. By and large, the people of, quote, Anglo-Saxon society are just English. Or they're Saxon. The various kingdoms that set up in England were Saxon kingdoms. Or you were Yayat, or a Ute, or you were Dane, or you were English. Almost nobody was an Anglo-Saxon. And that term was appropriated in the 19th century by politicians who were pushing this idea of white hegemony in the expansion westward. In 1845, it is the fundamental term used to describe white Americans in urging them to spread westward. The Anglo-Saxon foot is already on that far shore. President Trump used the term Anglo-Saxon a couple weeks ago to do exactly the same thing. Fairly certain he didn't write that speech, because I'm fairly certain he wouldn't know an Anglo-Saxon if it walked up and bit him, if it even existed. I am fairly certain that he didn't write that speech. But whoever did, I'm looking at you, Stephen Miller, whoever did knew that it was coded as white. It is a dog whistle to white supremacists in this country to use the term Anglo-Saxon. I will repeat that. It is a dog whistle to white supremacists in this country to use the term Anglo-Saxon because of the perceived heritage of somehow this great warrior society. Jefferson actually started it, Thomas Jefferson. He actually is one of the first people to acknowledge that Old English is English and not some version of German. He also wanted the Anglo-Saxon, quote unquote, people to be part and parcel of the American narrative. He wanted to have Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon invaders of England from about 480, to be on the American seal, and everybody else said no. No. So the adherence to the medieval past and trying to construct it as a justification for colonialism, imperialism, and racism and continued white supremacy is the foundation of medieval studies. I have said this before. But in 2017, that translates then into a reevaluation of the field as a whole. And people drew some pretty stark lines in the sand about this. And when they did, an awful lot of internal prejudices and structural problems in the way that we run our conferences were revealed. Several of the people who were the loudest voices, and I'm not going to give them a platform by naming them, you can Google all this shit and find out exactly who I mean. But one of those people was at the IMC, and you could smell the brimstone. And I thought their skirts hid their tentacles pretty well. And I say that, not mentioning that particular person, because I'm not platforming them. But there were scholars who started to attack other scholars who had the temerity to speak up. Scholars of color who said they didn't feel comfortable in our field. Scholars of color, women scholars, trans scholars who said, I don't feel safe here. If members of your household, of your community are saying, I don't feel safe here, it's our job to listen to them and make it safer. Not to say, oh, no, not us. We're not like that. You're wrong and you're oversensitive and you're overthinking it. Dear reader, they were not oversensitive. They were not overthinking it. And for a few years, the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo was a very dangerous place for some of my colleagues and friends. And arguably, in some respects, it might still be. If we haven't fully addressed this issue, It will continue to be. 10 years ago, almost 10 years ago, in 2017, in response to so many of these attacks, and it got ugly. I mean, the Facebook arguments back and forth. There are people who were friends of mine that I don't talk to anymore. Nope. That private messages back and forth. A very good friend of mine, who was a former student of mine, accused me of drinking the Kool-Aid of the people who were saying it was racist. I don't consider it drinking the Kool-Aid to stop and step back, consider my own privilege, and listen to my colleagues whose experiences have been different than mine. Those people who experienced violence, hatred, racism, and I haven't. Of course I haven't. So it's my job to listen to them. And those voices, of course, became very important. So in the aftermath of Charlottesville, medieval studies really started looking at itself. The International Society of Anglo-Saxonists decided to change its name. They still study pre-conquest England. They still study the period before 1066, but they don't call themselves the Society of Anglo-Saxonists anymore. Most people in this country who study that period don't call themselves Anglo-Saxonists. I was once one of those people who was part of that society, part of that group, and I've published, and Anglo-Saxon is in the title of my chapter, and I wish I'd changed it when I had the chance, but it was the very beginning of this discussion, and I should have been proactive. I should have changed it. But we can adapt. None of this is set in stone. It doesn't jeopardize my scholarly integrity to step back and go, hang on, I might have been wrong. I don't know everything. None of us do. And it's important to understand that the field itself needs to change. All of those attacks on the humanities that I talked about earlier, they are specifically also having a negative impact on medieval studies programs, because the languages and the literature of the Middle Ages, those same administrators who are like, well, why do you need to teach English? Also don't get, why do you need to teach stuff that's 1,000 years old? Perhaps if they'd done it, they would understand the answer to that question. But because of this backlash, because of the vehement response of people who just really just didn't want to give up the idea that no, we're not white supremacists. Look, if you got to hang on to it that tightly, chances are you are. Just saying. If anything I am saying here makes you go, hey, you're talking about me. Yeah, I probably am. If you think I'm talking about you, I probably am. All of this had a follow-on effect with the International Medieval Congress, both at Kalamazoo and at Leeds, because this is where all these scholars are together. And it had already been the case that several scholars of color really just didn't feel comfortable at Kalamazoo. In fact, my colleague, Nair Otano Gracia, wrote an exceptionally important blog piece in the middle. The blog is in the middle, called Lost in Our Field, Racism in the International Congress of Medieval Studies. And in it, Nair talks about that experience of being one of very few women of color in any given room, and people looking at her like, why are you here? Now, I personally cannot imagine what that feels like. I mean, I've experienced a little bit of it as a female scholar, and let me tell you, older white male scholars are really good at being patronizing. They really are really good at it. But Nair's experience was that of a woman of color as well. She had to deal with the intersectional racism and sexism of being a woman of color in a largely white male setting. And her piece was very important for letting those of us who were not aware of it because of our own white privilege, how daunting it was to go to a place like the IMC. And particularly in that aftermath of all of the Facebook fights, of all of the public hatred and vitriol levied against scholars of color who had the cheek to stand up and go, really? This is a racist field. It has been conducted in a racist way. Fix it. The backlash against those scholars was intense, to the point where some of these scholars were doxxed, they were threatened, they received death threats on Facebook, on Twitter, their information, doxing, publicly made available by some other scholars. Other scholars. attacked and made their colleagues unsafe, just to protect themselves and their pillar of white supremacy. You don't like being called white supremacist, then don't act like a white supremacist. It's that simple. Again, as I said, you don't want people to call you a Nazi, then don't act like a Nazi. Kind of simple. That had a follow-on effect within the field itself. Now, the Public Medievalist, which was an exceptionally good website, it still is, the material is still up there, but its lead owner and editor, Paul Sturtevant, is no longer publishing the Public Medievalist, and I kind of wish he still would. He started a series on race and racism in the Middle Ages before Charlottesville, and another one on gender and sexuality in the Middle Ages before Charlottesville. But of course, as a lot of those articles came out talking about race and racism in the Middle Ages, the problem is an awful lot of the contributors, partly because this is just what happens if you've got a platform and you've got a dedicated staff and you've got certain academics who write for you. If you don't start out with diversity, you don't necessarily attract diversity. And Sierra Lamudo wrote an exceptionally good piece about race and racism, specifically public medievalism and the rigor of anti-racist critique. Sierra Lamudo pointed out that, sure, you have well-meaning medievalists who are trying to say, well, that's not our Middle Ages. That's not the Middle Ages that we know and love, and there's nothing wrong with studying the Middle Ages. That is true. But there are problematic aspects of the Middle Ages. And those problematic aspects, as Martin Schickman and Lori Finke point out, are what many white supremacists like about it. They like that about the Middle Ages. And then they build and create this completely overblown, exaggerated narrative, making it sound like, no, really, it was the haven of the white supremacist, which it was not. But Sierra Lamudo's piece was very important for explaining, again, this idea that when you've got mostly white scholars trying to talk about racism in the Middle Ages, then invariably they're losing the voices of the people who actually know. And that if you're going to have this conversation, provide a platform for the scholars of color, for the scholars of other marginalized communities, so that they can tell their own stories. But that is also not to pigeonhole those scholars and say that that's all they can do. Mary Rambaran-Olm pointed out that when she was a student studying Old English, she was an Anglo-Saxonist at a time when we were still using the term, people would look at her as a woman of color and say, why are you doing this? Why are you doing Anglo-Saxon? Why are you doing Old English? And she experienced racism from the sheer fact that people thought, well, this isn't your history, so why are you doing it? That is unequivocally wrong and the wrong way to approach any discipline of history. Nobody should look at another scholar and say, but these aren't your people. Why are you doing this? If that were the case, we would lose so many different voices. We would lose so much dialogue and texture in our scholarly conversations. But Mary Rambaran-Olm was completely castigated and doxxed and threatened for standing up and speaking out about the racism that she experienced in our field. Sierra Lamudo did too. Nair Otano-Gracia did too. Other scholars of color did too. And they actually took quite a brave stance to make public statements because that put them even more in the spotlight. And of course, the whole question of anti-racist critique and the need for being actively anti-racist is not enough to just say, okay, there was racism in the Middle Ages. Okay, there's racism in medieval studies. We have to actively dismantle it. This is where the International Medieval Congresses come in. Now, I have attended both of these conferences for years. I started in Leeds in 2009, largely because I can't afford to get over to England all that much. I would love to go over more often to Europe and to many places in the world. I just don't make enough money, let's be honest. But the Leeds Conference, as the European Medieval Conference, has the opportunity to include so many more people from all over the world. And it does, because in some respects, it's easier to get to Leeds, England, from African countries, from Asian countries, from Eastern European countries than it is from to get to the United States, especially now. And so Leeds has a completely different demographic of scholars. But unfortunately, many of those scholars also double down on their defensiveness at our colleagues who said, yeah, this is racist. White people, I am talking to you now. When people of color tell you something is racist, shut up, listen, and figure out how you can fix it and make it better. Ask questions. Ask people what they need, but also do the work yourself. This is what needed to happen in my field. And it is happening more and more. And I was pleased going back to the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo this year. We had far fewer people than we normally have. I think the big banner year for attendance was in 2015. There were 3,000 plus medievalists at that conference. I mean, it was always the biggest conference ever. This year, there were about 1,500 to 1,700 people there. But what I did see were more graduate students, master's students, PhD students, more students of color, more scholars who came from different backgrounds, different communities, who studied non-European things. This is a good thing. Some of those young scholars that I talk to in my TikTok videos are kind of the up-and-coming fresh face of medieval studies. And what we need to encourage those voices. We need to tell those people that, yes, medieval studies includes you. We need all of those voices. Because in order for our discipline, or for any academic discipline, to survive, we have to be willing to adapt. We have to be willing to embrace the diversity and the reality of the people in our field. Those are important voices. I learned so much from talking to those young graduate students and those young professors, early career researchers in medieval studies. Fascinating stuff. And I will get as many people on the podcast as guests as I possibly can. But we have to remember that these conferences are the starting point. If young scholars don't feel like they can be at the IMC, either in Leeds or in Kalamazoo, they're not going to come, which means they're not going to get the resources they need to further their research. They're not going to meet the publishers. They're not going to get the feedback on their conference papers. They're not going to have the community and the networking. That is integral for any academic career or trajectory or anything. And we all benefit from it. Kalamazoo is when we reset ourselves after we've been teaching for a year and grading papers, and in my case, grading composition papers, lots and lots of them. Kalamazoo is a chance to reset my academic brain. And I do that by talking to my colleagues. I do that by talking to the young people coming up in my field and sharing whatever knowledge of mine is useful to them. I've been in this game for 30 years if you count that first year that I went to Kalamazoo when I was 21 in 1995. I've learned a lot. I don't know everything. And I can share the benefit of my experience with those young scholars. But I learned from them too. New ways of thinking about text, new ways of thinking about historical documents, new ways of thinking about art and art history, archaeology. Digital humanities is a big thing that is coming into our field full force. We have to be able to change and adapt, but we have to be inclusive. We have to allow for all those voices, which is why the IMC needed to change. And it is changing. I don't know if it's changing enough for some of my colleagues and friends who were driven out by the racism and hatred and the inability of certain people to actually deal with it at the conference level. The administration of the conference has changed, and the administration of the conference is far more receptive to making sure that people feel safe. But I don't know if it's enough yet for my other colleagues who haven't been in years. And eventually maybe it will be, because their voices are important. Those scholars are important leaders in our community in many respects for speaking out when it was very dangerous for them to do so. The INC in Leeds has also taken certain measures. A little harder in some respects because the climate in European universities is very different and very fraught. And there were certainly some occasions where some of my colleagues were presenting papers and some of those white supremacists I won't name showed up and recorded bits and took them out of context and then posted really nasty things, again, doxing those scholars. That is unethical behavior. Nobody should do it. You're at a conference, behave like a fucking scholar, thank you very much, and show respect to your colleagues, period. Full stop, end of story. Which brings me to what I had to say as a respondent in my session for how to teach these in this fraught political moment. Now, my session, the papers ran a bit long, so I didn't have long to speak, but I really only needed to say what I needed to say in 5 minutes. And I started by pointing out, in 2022, when Glenn Youngkin became governor of Virginia, I was still teaching at Longwood, small, rural, public university in Farmville, Virginia. The first thing Glenn Youngkin did, he signed an executive order on his first day in office banning the teaching of CRT in all public universities, schools, classrooms. Critical race theory. Now, he did this without any actual understanding of what critical race theory actually is. Critical race theory is a legal premise, a legal philosophy that examines the way that race has affected the law. That's what critical race theory is. All the other things that people were calling critical race theory in Virginia schools about the Civil War and racism and enslavement really is just history for you and me. They called it CRT, but it really is just history. So when Glenn Youngkin signs this executive order banning the teaching of CRT in public schools in Virginia, including universities, he then also instituted a tip line for faculty and students to report their teachers or professors who taught CRT, to rat them out and essentially say, these people are teaching critical race theory. My response was to go into all 4 of my classes at Longwood. I was a full professor with tenure, and I taught critical race theory in all 4 of them. I taught my students exactly what it is and what it isn't. And then I reported myself to the tip line. And I ended my very long letter explaining to them how I had taught it in my classes, what it actually means, and what I said to my students at my public university. I ended it with, go fuck yourself, Governor Youngkin. Now, I said that to the audience at Kalamazoo. They looked a little shocked. But honestly, I kind of see that as our job as academics, especially those in positions of privilege, where your privilege protects you to a certain extent, and that you need to stand up for the people who are not protected as you are. So I did that, and the climate at the university in some ways got very difficult. Not because of that, because many of my colleagues were very liberal, but for other reasons. Pressures in Richmond, finances, the cutting of budgets, and just a general sense of bleh. So in 2024, I resigned. I was a full professor with tenure, and I resigned. And then I was lucky enough to get a contingent year-to-year contract teaching at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Now, I just finished my 2nd year at UMBC, and I'm year to year, so my contract comes up for renewal every year. I teach composition, and the theme is activism. Now, the articles I mentioned by Sierra Limudo and Nair Otania Gracia, I teach those. I also teach Paul Sturtevant's articles from the Public Medievalist, because all forms of writing are forms of activism. And it is incumbent on us to teach our students how to interrogate their sources, identify credible sources, to read and think critically, to articulate their ideas and their arguments well, to be efficient, but also to be eloquent, and to understand the difference between fact and fiction. And I told them the story of my student who asked whether or not I was going to teach both sides in my upper level class on misappropriations. And as I explained to all of my students every semester, we're going to start from the premise that Nazis are bad. I also tell my students on the first day of class, and I made sure I have a DEI statement in my syllabus. Now, I teach at a public university in Maryland, which is very different than teaching at a public university in Virginia. But in Maryland, we have a lot more support from our university system and our governor and our elected officials. And so I make sure that DEI is part of my syllabus. And I tell my students on the first day of class, I will not tolerate any racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamicism, transphobia, homophobia, any kind of bigotry at all. And if my students do it, I will step on them hard. Figure of speech, I won't physically step on them. I would never physically touch a student. I tell them that. And I say that while they're in this classroom, I want to hear what they think. I want them to express their opinion and know that everybody's opinion is valid. Notice I said valid, not necessarily correct, but valid. But they have to do it with respect. Respect for me as their professor, but most importantly, with respect for their classmates. Because they're scholars. They're not just students. They're not just kids sitting in a classroom absorbing stuff that they probably don't give a shit about. They need to be active participants in their own education. And they need to do it as scholars with respect, with dignity that they would expect in turn. And most importantly, when confronted with this question of how do we teach this in our classes, how do we teach at this political moment, honesty. I am honest with my students. I don't hide my political ideology. I don't hide my political persuasion. I will listen to students on all spectrums. They choose a controversial topic. They write about it. I will never, ever grade a student on whether or not I agree with them. They have to back it up. They have to do research. They have to have facts. They have to have evidence. They want to make a point in the class, a political point, fine. But they've got to support it. That's what we teach in English classes. Mine is a composition class, so we do a lot of it in writing. They've got to scaffold papers and learn how to do outlines, annotated bibliographies, find credible sources, know the difference between credible and verifiable sources. They've got to write an informative paper that is neutral, that takes a controversial issue that they choose, and they need to not take a side because they need to look at every position for that issue. And then they can turn it into an argumentative paper, but it has to be an argument based on facts, data, and things they can prove rather than simply deeply held beliefs. That is why all of this is so important. And as I explained in my response at Kalamazoo, we have to be honest with students, and we have to give them an opportunity to be honest with us. We owe it to them to tell them the truth about where we are and about our history, how we got here, and ideally, how we can get out of it. I'm Dr. Larissa Tracy, and this is Medieval Mischief and Mayhem.